Thank you. I also want to thank you all for joining today. As Claudia already mentioned, I'm going to look at border corruption at the Kapitan Andreevo checkpoint in Bulgaria. Claudia, can you go to the next slide? Kapitan Andreevo is among the busiest land borders in the EU as it connects Turkey with the EU. Billions of euros of goods flow through it annually, especially food and agriculture products. And the economic, political, and institutional dynamics there have significantly shifted since Bulgaria's accession to the European Union, which is also why part of our research there focuses on this shift pre-accession to post-accession. However, despite a very complex legal and institutional framework, as well as EU monitoring and public scrutiny, corruption has persisted for decades and is still persisting at the Kapitan Andreevo border checkpoint. Claudia, next slide, please. The following authorities that you can see on the slide are present at Kapitan Andreevo. Obviously, border police, which mostly does passport controls and trafficking controls, custom agents, which are responsible for supervision of customs procedures and control of goods, vehicles, and individuals. There's also a food and safety agency present, which manages phytosanitary and veterinary controls. And other authorities, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were health inspectors present at the border checkpoint. Claudia, next slide, please. Traits of corruption at Kapitan Andreevo include that the lines between petty and grand corruption are quite blurred, which means that small bribes, which are typical for petty corruption, occur in a very systematic and organized manner and span across multiple agencies. That means that they can arguably also be components of grand corruption as it adds up to a big amount. As we also will see at Kapitan Andreevo, there are high collusion risks due to the presence of social networks between law enforcement and criminal organizations. There's also coercion risks of private citizens and business players being coerced by border guards and customs officials, as well as similar to what Saba said at the Rotterdam harbor, there are also infiltration risks, which has specifically one case I have in mind is the case of a private actor performing key checks instead of a state actor, and that private actor having allegedly political and criminal links. But we will look into that a bit more at a later point. As already mentioned, these corrupt practices are not isolated and have a systemic and organized nature. They are part of a organized, repeated, and routinized scheme, which involves officials belonging to the different authorities present at the border checkpoint. Because they happen regularly over long periods of time, these even small bribes and sometimes large bribes can accumulate into significant sums of money, which also motivates corruption from the side of officials at the border. Next slide, please. Corruption at Kapitan Andreevo is facilitated by a grey economy in Bulgaria, which still is estimated to take up around 30% of the market. This lack of transparency in the market creates a fertile ground for corrupt exchanges. Also, since Bulgaria's accession to the EU, there has been significant increase of traffic through the border checkpoint. The infrastructure and oversight system at Kapitan Andreevo thus struggle to keep up with these high volumes of traffic, also particularly pronounced during peak travel seasons in summer. This overstretches the system, allowing for corruption and smuggling to go undetected. In some cases, law enforcement officers, custom officials, and even smugglers are part of the same social or family networks as previously mentioned. And these personal connections can lead to informal protection, silence, and strong resistance in investigations or reforms. Another higher risk is the freight transport. It is especially vulnerable because it needs multiple clearance checks and has weak enforcement. Next slide, please. In this next part, we will look at the key drivers at Kapitan Andreevo. And in our research, we have found that these key drivers constitute 3 domains. We have separated in these 3 domains, but it is also important to keep in mind that they sometimes overlap and are very interconnected. And thus it is a little vague. You will see in the next couple of slides that it is a little vague to separate. As mentioned already, these corrupt dynamics shift over time. And we've seen a particular shift after Bulgaria's accession to the EU, which is why we will look at how these drivers and domains evolve before and after the accession of Bulgaria to the EU. Claudia, can we go to the next slide? During the 90s and early 2000s, the Bulgarian economy was characterized by a centralized economy, as well as rigid production structures, which led to the Bulgarian market facing economic decline. This meant that there was a shortage of consumer goods, which was compensated by the illicit importation of these goods with the help of bribes and illicit exchanges, which led then to a growing informal retail sector infiltrated by criminal organizations. After Bulgaria's accession to the EU in 2007, a free economy and modern retail sector were introduced. With it also came the introduction of new standards, regulations, and on the quality and security of legally traded goods, as well as stricter requirements for entry of goods into Bulgaria. This led to a changed role of bribes and illicit exchanges, with corruption linked to the smuggling of goods, now mostly focusing on how to avoid detections of non-compliant goods. However, there was this more general shift away from smuggling of illicit goods and more towards corruption as a means to facilitate the importation of illicit as a means to facilitate the promotion of financial frauds and tax evasion schemes on legally imported goods. As an example of this, imagine a importation from Turkey through Bulgaria to a third country, let's say Romania. But then once the truck enters Bulgaria, the export from Bulgaria to Romania is only fictitious and the goods actually stay in Bulgaria. However, because it has been announced as an import from Turkey to Romania, taxes and VATs are not being paid in Bulgaria for these goods. That's an example of such a tax evasion scheme. Next slide, please. When looking at criminal dynamics and illicit flows, we see that before the accession to the EU, criminal flows through Kapitan Andreevo mainly include the smuggling of fuel and tobacco via the so-called no man's land between the borders. This was enabled at a street level by localized networks and long-standing relationships with custom officers and border guards as to the criminal organizations and smugglers that were at play at that time. At a higher level, it was enabled through collusion and integration of such schemes into the broader political economy. A very well-known example of this is the case of Kosio Samakovica, who exerted significant control over the illicit trade through Kapitan Andreevo in the 90s. by paying bribes to officers, but also by using up 60% of his profits from illegal smuggling toward maintaining his protection. His influence reportedly reached as far as the director of customs authority. Here you can see that these criminal dynamics also flow into the political influence. After the EU accession in 2007, we see a shift in both the structure of border control and how corruption functions. With the accession not only to the EU but also to Schengen, the before mentioned duty-free shops and petrol stations in the no man's land were shut, and thus smuggling took a different dynamic. The legislation were harmonized, and new procedural standards for both border guards and customs agents were introduced, as well as new technological innovations and control and surveillance systems, which led for the smuggling to be a lot more difficult. This is a similar effect as they had at the Rotterdam harbor, as has been observed there, and Saba has mentioned. However, it's not as high-tech as it is at Rotterdam harbor. This led to criminals adapting their strategies accordingly, with the emphasis on shifting to concealment, especially for activities such as smuggling of large sums of undeclared cash and precious metals, stolen vehicles, and irregular migration, as well as drug trafficking. In drug trafficking, oftentimes there was corruption involved, but not specifically, or still is corruption involved, but not specifically for the trafficking of drugs, but for the importation of illegal goods. And then a customs officers or a border guard will be bribed for the importation of illegal goods, such as clothes or something in that sense. And then once a couple of truckloads of these clothes has gone through and nothing has happened, criminal organizations will mix in drugs into these cargoes. So, however, where criminals cannot rely on concealment, smugglers and criminals have to increasingly rely on corruption in order to avoid detection. One famous case of this is the Dimitrov case, which is a network of, I believe, father and son, which came out in 2024, and it demonstrates how the Dimitrov network embedded itself within stronger institutions, relying on corrupting officials at every level by bypassing enhanced enforcement. The network coordinated smuggling, especially of cigarettes, but also played a decisive role in influencing appointments, reshuffling custom officers, and building long-term informal relationships with senior figures in both customs and police, and even arguably the judiciary. This example of the Dimitrov network now leads us into the last domain, which is the political influence. Claudia, can you go to the next slide, please? In the late 90s and early 2000s, there were blurred lines between politics, administrative, customs duty, and this was marked by a revolving door system. The area around the checkpoint was specifically politically dominated by a Bulgarian Turkish party, which was sustained through a system of ethnic clientelism, leading to job contracts and protections in return for political loyalty. Political influence is maybe the point where I think it has changed the least. However, it has adapted a little bit since after the EU accession, these dynamics did not disappear. It was just a different party that rose, the Party of the Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria. However, clientelist and favoritist practices persisted, with this new party at the receiving end of political loyalty. Further, as mentioned in the beginning, privatization of core border functions emerged. For example, the official food safety laboratory was outsourced to Eurolab 2011, which is a private company with political connections. Following a government investigation, the company's license was revoked in 2022, and when it was returned to state authorities, the number of food safety violations detected increased tenfold. I believe this strongly suggests that the private operator had failed to properly carry out inspections. Now on to the next slide. The lessons learned from the research at Kapitan Andreevo is that we need to be aware of changes and potential watershed moments, and we need to recognize that corruption does not disappear, it adapts. Major changes like the EU accession and high-profile investigations can disrupt certain actors, but the underlying networks often reorganize rather than dissolve. Further, the increased enforcement efforts can create new risks, which we have also seen at the Rotterdam Harbour research. In this case, we saw that while stricter controls and new technologies make smuggling harder, they also raise the value of bypassing them, leading to more sophisticated concealment tactics and sometimes higher level corruption. Long-standing issues like clientelism and politicized governance still shape border operations, even after the structural reforms that took place after the accession to the EU. Informal power networks continue to influence appointments, inspections, and enforcement. Thus, in short, I would say tackling corruption requires more than just technical fixes. It demands attention to the political and institutional environment that supports it all. That is